It's really wonderful to see some old faces in the room and also to see some new faces that are joining us for this Global Existential Challenges seminar. And since there are some new faces, I wanted to start off by just giving you a sense of what this seminar series is trying to do, and then I'll also line up the speakers for today. So last year, we started this Global Existential Challenges seminar series really as an effort to do a few things. One was, as the theme notes with kind of grandeur, to really start off by thinking about some of the key themes that we're tackling, that we're confronted by on the global stage that have this sort of existential character, ones that we're all puzzling through, ones that we're concerned about, both as scholars, but oftentimes also from a normative perspective. So that was the first idea, to pull people together around these core issues. But second, we thought, especially coming out of COVID, that we really were eager to rebuild community and to be able to learn from our colleagues. So there are so many wonderful seminars where we have the opportunity to invite in outside speakers. Oftentimes, there are very few opportunities for us to hear from our colleagues who are here, and even fewer where our colleagues get to speak to one another on a given panel. So those are sort of the twin ideas that form this particular panel on a seminar series on global existential challenges. And the ambition is obviously to learn about these issues, to learn cross disciplines rather than only thinking about them within our scholarly silo, and also hopefully to generate new conversations, ones that might not have happened previously. So that's the ambition. Last year, we had a wonderful set of seminars. Many of you were in the room, so I hope that you enjoyed those conversations around democratic backsliding and climate change and reproductive rights, amongst many other issues. And this year, we're going to continue in that vein. And before I say a little bit more about that, I really want to start off by thanking the Pierce team that makes all of this happen. So I will be introducing these seminar series each time, but it's really the Pierce staff that has made all of this happen. And so I want to thank Kimberly Bitterman, who's sitting right in that front row. You can wave so they know who you are. She has played a key role. So yes, this would be appropriate to give a round of applause. But there are also many others who have helped out in the Pierce staff community as well. And so I just want to thank all of you both for doing all that you do in the background and also for engaging with us here today. All right, so this semester, we have a pretty exciting lineup. Let me just give you the themes that are coming up, and then I will talk about the panel. So this panel in particular is focused on authoritarian politics, coercion, and dissent. On October 12th, we'll have another panel on free speech, ethics, and democracy. On November 2nd, we'll have another panel on public health and well-being, learning from the past and thinking about the future. And then on November 30th, we'll have a final one for the fall on politics and information digital technologies, debating peril and promise. So you can see these are big themes that we hope will be interesting to all of you, if not to all of you. And if you can return, that would be great. All right, so today, obviously, you're here because we want to tackle the theme of authoritarian politics, coercion, and dissent. And I want to focus on this for a moment by saying that when we thought about this panel, we really wanted it to complement the two panels that we had last fall that were focused on democratic backsliding. So we had a panel that focused on democratic backsliding in the global north. We had another panel that focused on democratic backsliding in the global south. But obviously, that leaves out the very question of what is happening within authoritarian regimes, both in terms of coercion and dissent, amongst many other issues. And this is pressing not just because the theme in and of itself is critical, which it is, but because we find increasingly that the number of people who are living under authoritarian or autocratic regimes has increased. So if you've looked at the latest VDEM reports, this is the Varieties of Democracy reports that track over time what has happened. They have noted now that most of the world's population now lives in autocratic regimes of one sort or another. Since autocratic countries are far more populous than democratic ones, there are now about 72% of the world's population, 5.7 billion people, are living in autocracies, be they closed or electoral ones. So this is something which is obviously critical for us to think about, and we have the incredible pleasure of having 4 speakers from our faculty community to talk with us. I'm going to list them, not give a long bio because it's time for them to take the stage. But first, we'll hear from Behrooz Ghamari-Tabrizi. He's a professor of Near Eastern Studies, and he is, moreover, the director of the Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. He's a sociologist, and he will kick us off with some comments. He'll be followed by Elizabeth Nugent, who is an assistant professor of politics, having joined us, having just previously been at Yale, and returning to Princeton, having been here prior to that. She studies the politics and political psychology of authoritarianism, particularly focused on the Middle East. She will be followed by Yashar, who's the Bert G. Kerstetter 66 University Professor of Sociology, and also the director of the Paul and Marcia Wythe Center on Contemporary China, based here at Pierce. And then finally, there will be a 4th speaker who's going to come in shortly. He's finishing up a class that ends at 12:10, but he'll be coming in after that. And that will be Grigore Pop-Eleches. He's a professor of politics and international affairs, and also the chair/editor of World Politics. And so, again, we have 4 speakers for today's panel. I want to say that when I was thinking about pulling them together, there were a few things I was really keen on. One was to make sure that we had some disciplinary difference. So we have political scientists and sociologists on this panel, people who are speaking on different regions, and they will share the backgrounds of and the places that they're working on in the Middle East, Russia, and Eastern Europe, and China. I wanted people who were going to think about different levels, both what was happening domestically, but also internationally. And I also thought it would be interesting to have people who have different methodologies. That's a lot of difference. So let me remind you of the similarities, which is that they are all experts who focus on authoritarian regimes. They've written many books and articles on these themes, and they also share their generosity in coming in today to speak to us. So I want to give them a warm welcome and to say that each will have about 12 to 14 minutes to speak, time permitting. We'll have some discussion at the end. Let's give them a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you everyone for being here. Kimberly, thank you for all the hard work here. Since I'm a director of a center, I know how much work goes into putting together events like this, and my staff is always hard at work, and I sympathize with that kind of. This? Is this close enough? If I go closer, I would sound like the voice of God, you know. You don't want to do that. That's okay. All right. So I realized that this was an event on the question of authoritarianism and looking at the people who were invited to offer some thoughts on that. We are all from different regions of the world, Middle East, China, post-Soviet, Eastern Europe, and the post-Soviet republics. And I thought that, I kind of more interested in following up on sort of the conversation from last year about more democratic societies and to think about authoritarianism not as something that exists elsewhere. And I want to highlight that by thinking about authoritarianism in relation to something that is truly planetary and global, and that's the climate change. And I want to make a case eventually that climate change and the emergence of authoritarianism are closely linked to one another, and make a case about the second act of Empire Strikes Back. If some of you are familiar with that notion in the early 1980s, when there is a sort of a new generation of immigrants from former colonies going to Europe, that concept of Empire Strikes Back was very, very prominent at that time. And I think that there is a second act of that Empire Strikes Back in the form of the emergence of authoritarianism in former colonizing powers. In the mid-1980s, the German sociologist Ulrich Beck coined the term risk society as a reference to the surge in technological rationalization through which modern capitalism has produced an ecological transformation that will forever change the existing social and political orders. The rise of neoliberal, unregulated, naked capitalism, whatever we call it, disaster capitalism, in the 1980s made it easy for critical observers to identify with that notion of risk society as the main peril of modern nation states. At the time that Ulrich Beck and many others after him coined the term, Chernobyl meltdown was on everybody's mind. The chemical disaster in Union Carbide plant in Bhopal, India, that killed thousands of people and affected more than 500,000 people in India didn't get much of attention later, but nevertheless it's an important event. And sort of conversation about the ozone layer, the hole in ozone layer was the concern at the time. 40 years later, our understanding of ecological consequences of that technological rationalization has deepened our fears of its social and political consequences. Climate change has and will further disrupt every facet of our current political system, and climate researchers speak of the climatization of global politics. As a new economic crisis, increased numbers of refugees due to ecological collapse, intensification of resource conflicts, disruption in global supply chains, and crises in diplomacy are all likely consequences of a warming planet. Here I don't intend to draw a causal assertion between climate change and authoritarian politics. Rather, I would like to argue that there has been a co-constitutive and reciprocal process that shaped the relation between the two. For more than 2 centuries, the foundation of political legitimacy, both for liberal and illiberal states, has been informed by the developmentalist project of high growth and high consumption. In this model of market capitalism, political legitimacy, either through popular electoral or populist mass politics, have been based on economic performance, jobs, and growth. In the past 2 centuries, growth have been the taken for granted concept around which political orders and economic relations have been envisioned and implemented. Colonialism was justified by it. Post-war modernization projects relied on it, and post-colonial states desired it. Both liberal and Marxist thinkers subscribe to that idea that economic growth and industrialization will end backward societies and will liberate them from what Marx once called a vegetative state of life. This liberation, however, came with a hefty price in political, economic, and ecological terms. This hefty price was carefully examined very early on by this now classic book, of Alfred Crosby, Ecological Imperialism and the Transformation of Fauna and Flora of native lands by invasion of colonial powers from Europe to the new continent. The political consequences, John Stuart Mill called, of course, John Stuart Mill was an employee of the British East India Company, one of the main thinkers of political liberalism. We leave the irony aside there for a second, you know. And he very explicitly argued that despotism is a necessary requirement for the colonized in order to improve their lives. Marx, I want to be all inclusive here. You know. Marx, in the preface to the first volume of Capital, argues that for the less developed, industrial societies only show a mirror of their own future. So this is not a kind of a liberal or Marxist or socialist and capitalist division, but this is sort of the emergence of modern society, that in one way or another all were invested in massive industrialization of societies, with which in non-Western societies, despotism was a requirement, and that requirement continued to be the case after Second World War, with post-colonial states, emergence of post-colonial states, justified by sort of containment of communism, and of course with the Soviet bloc, containment of capitalist states. But despotism was an important part and parcel of industrialization. And of course, the other side of it was this massive industrialization around the world, which led to urbanization of the entire planet. I'll give you one quick example. The population of Tehran, by the way, I should have said that I work on the Iranian history. So the population of population of Tehran grew from 2.5 million in mid-1970s to now close to 14 million. The great example of this urbanization and the perils of this urbanization, Lagos, from 1966, population 1 million to today 16 million people living. So just imagine what kind of environmental degradation and the collapse of resources we are facing with this kind of rapid urbanization and industrialization of the entire planet. Of course, this massive displacement brought with it environmental degradation to the extent that basically the evening news these days starts with flood in Libya 2 days ago, and flood in Pakistan all last year, fire in Australia, fire in California, massive drought in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, unprecedented droughts that forced millions and millions of people to be displaced. And I would argue that this kind of displacement, which a prime example of that we see in the Mediterranean region, and I would like to argue, maybe later we can have a conversation about that kind of situation in Mediterranean is the context within which authoritarianism is on the rise in Europe, especially now in Italy. And we have the same situation with our southern borders, that massive pressure on the resources, borderland resources, from migration of from Latin America, Central America to the US, and that shapes really the rise of this right-wing populism in the United States. We're getting very close to our own country here to become a banana republic because of all these changes that are happening. And I think that is a very, very important part of the emergence of authoritarianism here. There are massive resistance to this environmental degradation. People who are trying to protect their land, and increasingly, the most significant sources of resistance comes from people who are protecting their environmental resources. Global Watch just released this estimate that more than 2,000 people were killed, people who were trying to protect their, mostly from indigenous people, protecting their own habitat, their environment. And unfortunately, more than 80% of those murders happens in Latin America, Brazil, Mexico, and Honduras are sort of on top of that list. So to just wrap it up, I think we are really dealing with a planetary crisis. That planetary crisis is based on these kind of massive climate change that is causing massive migration, displacement, lack of resources, and it's forcing all different countries around the world. I mean, hopefully we get a chance to talk about different regions in the world more specifically to push them to the limits of access to their resources. And now, as I said, the second act of Empire Strikes Back is forcing the European countries as well as the US to face this possibility of rising despotic and authoritarian governments. Thank you.
Yeah.
Which one's yours?
This one. Great, thank you. Great. Well, I'm going to be talking about a slightly different kind of displacement, although I feel like there's so much to unpack here. Hopefully we'll get to do that later. This looks fine up here. Okay. So I'm going to be talking today about exile. It's probably a term that you think you know the definition to. If you look in political science, there are very bad definitions of this. Or not bad, just imprecise definitions of this. While exile is not necessarily a contemporary phenomenon, right? It's existed as long as we've had place-based politics, right? Which predates the international state system. There are reasons to think about why, in the current contemporary moment, exile is different, both in terms of respect and the porousness of borders, the international migration regime, and also the existence of the internet, right? Which allows for a more simultaneous participation of people that are politically displaced in politics. So I want to just start my timer, which I forgot to do. So as Deborah's mentioned, I work on authoritarianism in the Middle East. And one thing that has happened over the last 10 years has been the Arab Spring uprisings, which really destabilized or was looking like it might destabilize long-term authoritarianism in the region, has not resulted in the democratization that many were hoping for. Exile, in particularly the case that I'm interested in here, Egypt, has become the name of the game for regimes hoping to repress opposition that really felt emboldened by the disruption that was 2011. So in terms of a definition here, I think of exile rather as a type of migration, although I'll get into that in just a second. Rather, I think of it within the realm of repertoires of repression that regimes can use to do what they do with other kinds of repression, right? Demobilize dissent, fracture opposition. Here, this happens through physical dislocation from national territory instead of putting somebody in jail or even, removing them by killing them. The definition that I'm going to use is this coerced migration. Coerce is important because I think when we talk about other kinds of forced migration, right, from a natural disaster, it's a bit different. There's significantly more choice often for people, even under conditions that are very difficult, to make choices about where they end up, where they go. I also want to highlight this definition of punitive political reasons. So it's very much in response to either actual political opposition or threatened political opposition. So as I mentioned, right, exile as a tactic from a regime is meant to disrupt opposition. It's meant to squash opposition. But over the last 10 months, I got to spend time in Berlin, starting to think about how exile looks among current Egyptian exiles. And what I found was rather than, some of my assumptions about going into the field from the literature had to do with, these people are coming from Egypt, which is a solidly authoritarian regime right now, going into, for all intents and purposes, a democratic system, right? Maybe the political opportunity structure might be changed in a way that should shape their activism and change it. At the same time, there is literature on migrants who, once they leave one country, these are all voluntary migrants, but once they leave one country, how being in another one both shapes their political behavior in those new countries and also directed towards home, things like remittances or even online activism. But what I found is that there's significantly more continuity than I expected rather than this disruption within individuals. So people who are doing very similar things to what they were doing in Egypt 10, 20 years ago. Within networks, so groups of activists who have now been displaced. I'm going to talk quite a bit about Berlin, but there are communities of Egyptian exiles in most major cities and metropolitan areas in the world. But there's still this simultaneity of communication within networks that can be mapped to how they looked back in Egypt before 2013. And then finally, this continuity between within national political space. What I mean by that is between home, in this case, Egypt, and exile space. I was going in expecting very much that in other cases, like in Venezuela, you start to see activists targeting the host government. In Egypt, as I'll show you in a couple of slides, almost all of the activism that's happening is spurred by something that happens back at home. So in trying to make sense of this, the theory that I'm developing, and it's still very much in development, so comments are welcome, is rethinking revolution and exile as political trauma, not necessarily a shifting of political opportunity structures. And as a result, I've been looking at some of the medical literature on political trauma and thinking about the political process as almost a recovery and a return to self. I'll get into this in just a little bit. So let me tell you a little bit more about my case. This is a quote from the late Egyptian activist Sara Higazi. As Saint just said, those who make half a revolution dig their own graves. It was literally not just figuratively true. Most of us are now in the grave, in prison, or in exile. So as I briefly mentioned, and I don't have a ton of time, I teach a whole course on this. In 2011, there were massive uprisings known as the Arab Spring in Egypt, which was the second country to witness mass mobilization. Hosni Mubarak, who had been in power since 1981, resigns. It ushers in a 2-year period that we might call a democratic experiment. There are free and fair elections, lots of protests happening. It was a very exciting time. Within 2 years, partially because the Muslim Brotherhood did very well in those early elections, also won the presidency and then ruled very heavy-handedly. The military stepped in July 2013, performed a coup, and installed the current president of Egypt, retired General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. He's currently still in power. He was Trump's favorite dictator, if that means anything to you. And he may be in power through 2030. So we're back to even worse authoritarianism than existed under the regime that was ousted. And in line with that, there's been 60,000 political prisoners. This dwarfs the 30,000 that were documented under the previous regime. Most of these arrests also happen within a 2-year period, and they're Brotherhood members. In addition, the regime has innovated, and where it has used exile on an individual basis before, it's now using it as kind of a wide-scale repressive tactic. There have been three major waves. One wave that kind of predates what I'm looking at. This is 2011, so this is the uprising that ousts the old regime. This is 2013. This is when that coup happens. So migration data, as I'm learning, is not great. But what I can tell you about this is there's a massive change in asylum claims, right? So people who can prove that they have a political asylum claim, right? There are different laws around this. After not only 2011, but after 2013. So in the 10 years leading up to the revolution, there were about 13,000 political asylum claims from Egyptians. In the 10 years after, there are 116,000. So it increases tremendously. And it's important to note, too, I could show you, the numbers would be much more massive. I could show you a similar graphic for Syria. Syria currently has a civil war going on. Egypt does not, right? Politically, there's something happening. The national security situation has not changed dramatically that might explain this kind of asylum fleeing. So in terms of where Egyptian exiles are going, Germany, the United States, the UK, and Turkey are some of the major destinations. There are also other populations that are traveling through places that Egyptians don't need visas to go to. So they show up there, claim asylum, or show up there and then transit to other places. It's also an interesting, this may be getting too in the weeds, but there's an interesting bump here where you start to see people's passports expiring. And the consulates and the embassies abroad have been weaponized to make it very difficult for people who left, maybe thinking it was temporary, to then figure out how to get their Egyptian passport renewed. Okay. So I just want to go quickly through these 3 levels of continuity that I talked about. So this is, I'll just talk about one of these individuals. The gentleman on the left here, his first name is Ahmed. I just wrote this up the other day, and it was a weird moment. I interviewed him on March 1st, 2020 in Berlin. And then it took me 3 years, right, to get back and talk to him again. And it was amazing to me, both in thinking about how different his life was in 2020 from what it had been in Egypt, right? He was a father, he was a surgeon, he was an activist. When I met him in 2020, he was not having a relationship with his ex-wife. He no longer really spoke with his child. He was trying to figure out what he was going to do with medicine. By the time I met him in 2023, he was now into acting. He had reconnected with his son. He was engaged to a German woman. And throughout all of this change, right, a lot is going on here. His activism is very, very similar. The kinds of things he's doing and did in Egypt, in exile, very similar. He's, kind of one of these more independent activists that we might talk about. The gentleman on the right, Safwan, is more of what we might call a moderate. In Egypt, he was part of the Kifaya movement. He had been involved with parliamentary campaigns for opposition movements like Behrooz. He's hoping to become a German citizen and run for a position, an elected position in a municipal council, right? So the same ideas, the same behaviors, once they've recovered, gotten their citizenship, figured out their asylum claims, very much their ideas about politics are not changing, right? A moderate in Egypt is still going to be a moderate abroad. So in terms of the community within networks, the continuity within networks, the patterns of exile, so who goes where, It's not perfect. A big question is always, is there some kind of selection effect, right? Are Egyptians going where they already know people? There's some of that, but the international migration regime is difficult to control. But more importantly, what happens after they get that security of either being on an asylum claim or getting citizenship elsewhere, where they travel very much is dictated by who they knew from before. In addition, as I mentioned, and I don't have a ton of time to get into this, but the way that exiles are currently using encrypted ICT programs, internet communication technology, constant communication across time zones, coordinating, mobilizing. And then in terms of everyday behavior, one thing that struck me was, particularly in Berlin, this is a talk that was given by the historian Khalid Fahmy. He's Egyptian. He's actually in exile now, too. This is an entirely Egyptian space. People are speaking Egyptian Arabic. Many of these folks spend a lot of time together. Many of them haven't learned German, even though they've been there for, at this point, since 2015. My point here is that in their everyday behavior, they're rebuilding the type of life that they had before. And then finally, just very quickly, this continuity within national political space, thinking about home and exile as more linked than we might have thought about theoretically before. I have a data set of 450 protests in these cases. So in Berlin, in London, in the DC, New York area, and in Istanbul, and looking at the patterns. So they happen when Sisi shows up to meet with his counterparts in the government. They also happen on meaningful anniversaries related to some of the key days of the revolution. And then they always happen when contentious politics are happening at home. If there is a campaign at home, there's going to be a campaign in London. If there are protests at home, and there have been some really interesting instances, even in this repressive environment, of protests, there's going to be a protest in Berlin. What's interesting is that in unpacking this with some of the organizers, their audience is not the folks that live in their host country. It's the Egyptian opposition at home, in jail, and those who are kind of burying the revolution and having to go about their regular everyday lives. These signs are in Arabic. The chants are in Arabic. They are not necessarily targeting, this foreign audience. What they want to do is show the opposition at home. The revolution continues. So with that in mind, this is my last slide. What I want to suggest is that exile, which is a type of repression, again, it's not new, but I think there's something very unique about it in the current moment. Scholars are also starting to pay attention to it. Transnational repression is kind of a hot topic right now. What I want to say is that exile displaces opposition, but it doesn't disrupt it. It doesn't fundamentally alter the nature of opposition. And what I've been talking mostly about is this idea of recovery. So, you're going along, you have your trauma, and you kind of just go back to the same level. Another concept in the trauma literature is this idea of post-traumatic growth, where, you have this terrible event happen to you and you change for the better. That is much more rare. But one thing that I think is interesting and might show some evidence of the Egyptian opposition having this post-traumatic growth has to do with increasing cooperation, and it's small, it's limited, between kind of an Islamist and a non-Islamist opposition. I'll just pose 3 quick questions that maybe we can get to in the Q&A. As a comparativist, I always think about what is Egypt a case of, and who might you compare Egyptians with? Egyptians might say nobody, but I think you can compare them. So first, I mentioned Venezuela before. Venezuelan exiles have really turned their attention towards lobbying foreign governments to intervene and change the regime. Egyptians have not. And so there's an open question there of why that is. In being in Berlin, there's a huge Syrian refugee and exile population. And something that struck me in doing, some of my field work was that Egyptians tend to think they are going home in this life. Syrians do not. And so that time horizon is very different about who you might marry, whether you're going to learn German, whether you're going to try and get citizenship or not. And then finally, the brotherhood, which I only alluded to very briefly, has been impacted much more heavily by exile. But they are doing, especially in Istanbul, things that they already did. They're resetting up the organization in the same structure and focusing on that social service provision that we all know they are quite good at. So thank you.
Okay, I would like to talk about China and authoritarianism in China. Let me begin with two caveats. This is a topic I don't know much about, so I'm a student, I'm a beginner. On the other hand, I do know a lot about China, and most Americans don't know much about China at all, actually embarrassingly so. So I'm going to tell you what I know about China, and in the end, I will give you a primer to Chinese history. So let me begin with the definition of authoritarianism, because I don't know what that is, and this is a definition from Wikipedia. And by that definition, China definitely fits very well. Chinese government is an authoritarian government. Chinese politics is authoritarian politics. And when we talk about authoritarianism, especially at Princeton appears in books and discussions, there is an assumption. I'm going to change assumption to belief. The assumption is that authoritarianism is bad. It's bad for environment, it's bad for human rights, it's bad for education, it's bad for almost everything. And that is assumption, but assumption could be wrong. I will change assumption into belief. I believe authoritarianism is bad on many grounds. I cannot prove it is not necessarily bad. We often think authoritarianism will cause a lot of social problems. But Chinese government, on the other hand, takes the opposite view. Chinese government thinks authoritarianism, Chinese style, is a solution to social problems, such as environment, such as lack of living standard, poor education, high crime, mass exile. All those problems can be solved with authoritarianism, Chinese style. So if you read articles, books coming out of China from the state media, there is a lot of justification on the authoritarian style of government. This is from, the first is taken from Global Times, the official newspaper in English, published by the Chinese government. China, to march toward modernization, was institutional advantage. China sees authoritarianism as a huge advantage. And this is a book, a chapter title with a title, Institutional Advantage. What do they mean by institutional advantage? This is a second phrase, is a governance efficiency. You want to reduce crime, if you want to reduce pollution, if you want to improve education, you force people to do things they would not do otherwise. That is the main message. And they also provide quite a bit of evidence, and I list few that's often cited. We all know there has been rapid and sustained economic growth, unparalleled in history and anywhere else for so long at such a large scale. There's a provision of infrastructure such as roads, bridges, subways, and rail systems. Government provides it because companies will not do so. Individuals will not do so. China also is well known for providing high quality education. Scientific and technological accomplishments have been rapid in China. You also have adequate and relatively inexpensive health system. Crime rates are low in China. Poverty rates are low in China. And they're all being documented. Also, there is relevant to geopolitical politics, US-China conflict. China is becoming very strong militarily. I just give you one example taken from newspaper. A 2022 headline says China's life expectancy is now higher than that of the US. Chinese live longer now. Of course, some of that is due to COVID. And this presents a puzzle, a difficult question for us. Well, how do we understand China? How do we understand authoritarianism? By the way, I'm not agreeing with all of this, and I'm not political myself. I'm an empirical sociologist. I try to understand things as they are, even though I have my beliefs. And my belief is democracy is better than authoritarianism. But that is not my job. My job is to understand what's going on in China. My belief is not my job. I'm not paid for my belief. I'm paid for my work. So my work is to understand China as what it is and what has been. And my approach is that China can be best understood within its own historical, social, political, and cultural contexts. We should understand China from China's perspective empirically. I'm building a website. I don't know if this comes up or not. No. We are building a China Center Understanding China website with lots of data. Let me give you one example, if I can open this up. It's still under construction. High-speed rail. Do I have that? No, I cannot. Yeah, basically, China now, I cannot get this to work. Okay. This is the length of high-speed rail from 2008. China started with the same point as US, which is almost zero, and where China is now and where US has been. So in terms of infrastructure for transportation, and almost many charts we have on this website gives you such sharp comparisons. And we can talk about homelessness, we can talk about, I show you life expectancy, and many other examples. Let me give you, so what I'm trying to do next. I'm trying to write a book. And it's a very difficult book to write because Americans, not only they don't know anything about China, they don't want to know anything about China. So it's hard to tell people things they don't want to know. So finally, I have come up with a title to understand China. You know, understand three colors: yellow, red, and blue. Yellow means ancient China, imperial Chinese system. Red, communism, Soviet style. Blue, Western influence, overseas influence. And in almost domain in Chinese society, the three colors will give you a very good, accurate description and understanding from education to law, to economy, to family, to political government, and so on. So it's not fixed. It's not just red. Actually, a lot is yellow. So give you a primer to Chinese history. Actually, I've learned, even though I'm a quantitative sociologist, only because I cannot do anything else better. Otherwise, I choose to be a philosopher or historian. I probably will not become a political scientist, but I would really like to be a historian and philosopher. For lacking other skills, I end up being a sociologist, but I've been reading history. So let me give you a primer to Chinese history as I understand it. And probably if you don't know anything about China, it's a good lesson. Chinese imperial system, which is more or less has been the same from ancient time, 200 BC to the present, from Qing dynasty, has not changed much. It's a unique political system with really no parallel in the world. It claims to have no equals in the world. There's a big dispute with the West, is that you call you're equal with China. Nobody's equal with China because China is everything. So it has has a different claim than European states. It's very large, has a large population and territory. I'm going to show you a map. It has its own logical and ideological justification as a civilization. We all know in the West, religions defined civilizations in many ways. But in China, Confucianism and political ideology dominated the discourse. So it has self-contained ideological system. So this is the size of China in Han Dynasty, and in comparison to contemporary China, it was very large and vast. And the whole country has always been controlled by one government, with some exceptions. But in Han Dynasty, that big territory was controlled by central government through a system of delegation and hierarchy. So the government was divided into 3 levels. Now the government is divided in 5 levels, from the central government all the way to county level. Strictly hierarchical, nested structure as it is today. And they believe that system allows the central government to control every piece of the land, every family effectively. If they want to build a road, you have to move. If they find a criminal, you have no place to hide because everything is under one single government, and there cannot be theoretically rivalry or military conflict across regions. So let me give you, I have 2 minutes, let me give you a quick rundown of stylized facts. Ideally, it is a unified country with one emperor. In terms of territory, it's very vast. So China developed very sophisticated bureaucracy to rule the country. So bureaucracy was well developed, and that's why writing was well developed. That's why education was so important, because they eliminated nobility to rule the country. So you have to be educated, and only through education you can become high-level official. And it was run by civilians rather than military. So military had no political power, very little political power, except in times of transition. Otherwise, the country has always been run by civilians. And with exception, that's quite important to my work on social mobility and equality, is that with the exception of the emperor, virtually no political office was inherited. You have to prove your merit in order to have a position in society, political position in the government. And this system has lasted to the present. Look at the last one. There is a law of avoidance. So today, you all know Xi Jinping has an anti-corruption campaign, but such a style campaign was true more than 2,000 years ago. They always wanted to monitor and punish and institute regulations to control officials. You cannot serve in place where you have family ties. You cannot serve in the same place for more than 3 years, for example. So in conclusion, I know my time has run up. China's authoritarianism is going strong and will likely continue in China and affect other countries. It sets, in some ways, justification for the continuation of authoritarianism. Second, China's authoritarianism is not rooted was not imported from the West. Rather, it's rooted in Chinese imperial system and is accepted, not by me, but by lots of people in China. If not as a preferred, at least as acceptable form of government, alternative to democracy. And if you read what's going on in Chinese government today, you need to pay attention to the third point. There's a lot of yellow color in today's China. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me see if I can set this up here. Decided to take one slide out. Okay, so thank you very much, and I apologize for coming in late. I had to teach until 12:10, so it's a bit of a running roadshow here. So I'm going to focus on the obviously the theme of the seminar, perhaps in a narrower way, looking at this sort of dissent and coercion from the point of view of repression and protest. And I will be focusing primarily on the former Soviet Union, though I'll try to discuss some of the implications possibly beyond this. And I should say that I'm going to present some statistical evidence too, not particularly complicated. I'll try to talk you through it. I apologize for some of the barefoot empiricism here, but there's given the time constraints, there's only so much I can fit in. So the question here is about the effect of repression on future protests, right? Lots of authoritarian regimes face protests at some point, and then they're faced with this choice of whether to repress, how much to repress, whom to repress, and how to frame the repression. And that, of course, to a large extent, on the one hand, tries to deal with the immediate threat of the protest, and on the other hand, tries to deal with what they expect to happen afterwards, what are some of the longer-term consequences, right? And at a very sort of basic level and rooted in a rational choice framework, we can think of this decision as driven by how repression affects two aspects of the decision of whether to join a protest down the line or not, right? And one of them is that if the regime represses, it sends a message about the cost of protesting, right? If you watch on TV that protesters are being arrested and beaten up and shot and so on, the likelihood at some level of knowing this is a high cost issue is going to go up. You're also probably going to have some sort of sense that the government has the capacity to do so, especially if they manage to arrest people in lots of different cities and so on. On the flip side, so there's a big literature on this. On the flip side, there's a question of whether this repression in some sort of way gets people to think that the government is of a bad type, right? And so Susanne Lohmann has this work based on protests in late sort of GDR, November of 89 to about January 1990. And her whole framework is that people see these protests and they draw conclusions about the nature of the protesters on the one hand, and on the other hand, on whether the regime is good or bad. As somebody who grew up in communist Romania, it sort of always struck me as a little bit strange that by December 89, you would not have decided whether the government is good or bad. But still, the evidence that she presents does suggest that the way that the government represses and so on then has downstream consequences for sort of people joining the protest because they get mad at this or they're upset by the repression and so on, right? There's also a slightly different version of this argument, which is about closing windows of opportunity, right? If repression is increasing, there might be a sense that if we don't go protest now, we may never get to protest again, right? So there's this what the Germans call Torschlusspanic, right? Of sort of like worrying that the sort of doors are going to close unless we protest now. And of course, like much of the literature in the social sciences, we get mixed findings on a lot of these things. What I'm going to try to sort of argue here is that there are two additional ways of looking at this relationship between repression and protest that might be worth looking at. One of them, in the first study that I'm going to show you, is deals with the role of emotions. And so the fact that we may not just be learning certain types of information, but we may also be experiencing certain types of emotions as a result of seeing this. For any one of you who's either been to a protest and even has seen the threat of repression, let alone the actual repression, seeing these things on TV, for that matter, as well, right? And here there's obviously this trade-off between the fear that's demobilizing, and on the other hand, anger that's mobilizing. And obviously, this can also other emotions are possible. I'm going to focus on this for now. And what we know is that very often it's a mix of the two, and the question is, how does this then play out? The second one is to think about the fact that repression happens in authoritarian regimes in the context of biased and limited information. So, if somebody gets repressed and there's nobody there to see it or listen to it and so on, does that still matter? How does it matter how people experience this and so on? So the second study is going to look a little bit at the effects of this uneven information, of the effects of repression. So the first study is based on this work with Graham Robertson, Bryn Rosenfeld, and Sam Green, and it's based on a survey in Russia around the protests surrounding the arrest of Navalny in 2021. There were large-scale protests that the government met with quite a bit of violence, 11,000 arrests, lots of people brought to trial, and so on. And what we did is we ran an online survey in May and June of that year, so 2-3 months after this, not right away, but relatively soon after. And the question was to sort of see how people react to this repression. And so essentially, it's a survey experiment where the first set of one group of respondents were randomly assigned to just reading something about the protests themselves, saying there were these acts of protest in more than 120 cities in Russia. The treatment group got this plus a description of the repression, saying that 11,000 people were arrested, that there are 90 criminal cases facing up to 5 years in jail, and so on, right? So this, without showing, this was not a super strong treatment. We did not show people being beaten up by the police, but it still gave a sense of the sort of magnitude of this repression, right? And so then the question is, how does this affect, on the one hand, protest willingness? So we asked the question about whether people would be willing to join informal protests that are either small or large, and it turns out it doesn't make that much of a difference, so we just created an index out of that. We had some questions about information updating. We asked them, how likely do you think it is if you protest that you're going to get arrested, that you're going to get beaten up, that you're going to get injured? Created an index out of that as well, just to sort of make. And then there's a question about legitimacy, which is agreement with the statement that Putin deserves support. So it's their own opinion on this. On emotions, we asked them a battery of emotions, but we focus on anger and fear. Both of them, again, up to a 0 to 1. And then we have parties and subgroups based on a question that was asked before the survey started, before this experimental treatment, where we asked them whether they approve of Putin, disapprove of Putin, or are sort of in between. So quickly in terms of the results. So what this shows is the effect of seeing the repression treatment. So this is the comparison of the people who saw the repression treatment versus the people who were only told about the protests. And what you see is that if you look at all respondents, we see an increase in the likelihood of wanting to join a protest. And it's significant, it's not particularly large. But once we look at prior partisan differences, this is all concentrated among opponents, right? So seeing this experience of getting of the repression makes opponents more likely to want to go to join. On the other hand, it does not convince any of the undecideds, and certainly does not convince any of the regime supporters. So this is as a first step. So then next we try to test whether this is an information story. And what you see here, so on the left side is whether it changes people's view of the risk of protesting. And as the fact that all of these estimates go over the red dotted line means that there are no significant effects. In other words, being given this information about the repression in this protest does not get people to change their view of So it's not a sort of information updating. Similarly, if we ask about Putin legitimacy, it does not get affected, either overall or for any of the subgroups. However, what we do see is that emotional responses are significant. So if we look at the full sample, we see that both fear and anger increase. The effect is larger and more significant for anger than it is for fear, and this will be important. Once we break it down by partisan subgroups, we see, not surprisingly, that these effects are concentrated among the oppositionists, right? And here too, though, what you see is there is fear, but there's a lot more anger than there is fear. No emotional responses for either the oppositioner or the undecided in the lower part of the graph. The supporters. Okay, so again, this is the focus here. And then thinking about the effects of anger and fear on willingness to protest, as you would expect, higher anger makes you more likely to want to protest. These effects are stronger for the opposition again, though notice that they also happen for supporters and undecideds. The problem is that those guys don't experience anger to begin with, right? And then similarly for fear, we see effects in the other direction. But notice that these effects are smaller than the effects of anger. So the magnitude of the effect for fear is smaller. So again, this suggests that a big part of the story here is going from repression to anger to willingness to protest more. So this is the first set of findings. The second one is based on this on a very different kind of study in a way in Moldova in the context of the so-called Twitter revolution in 2009. This is work with Luke and Wei. And for those of you who don't remember too much about the Twitter revolution, and there's not that much of a reason to, so this happened after the elections in 2009 in Moldova. The communists had been in power for the last 8 years, had sort of consolidated their rule. There were these elections where there were some electoral fraud, not a huge amount by post-Soviet standards, but still there was a protest right after the election broke out. There was violence, and it was followed by pretty swift repression by the government. And importantly, this had very conflicting interpretations. The government story looked something like that. A bunch of violent pro-Romanian activists who were trying to burn down the state and so on. The opposition's story basically suggests here's a policeman who's watching the protester put up the EU flag. Clearly, they're trying to undermine the legitimacy of the protesters and so on. So the question is, how does this affect people? What we did is we have a panel survey that was fielded before and after the elections. And the important thing is that we have information on local arrests. And we have information about where the Pro TV station, which was the one independent TV station in Moldova that showed the point of view of the opposition, where it was received in Moldova, because they're basically these antennas, and outside of these circles that you see over there, people could not get access to this TV station, right? So essentially, we have within the survey some people who experience local repression while having access to the opposition TV, and others who don't. And what we see, and I'm running out of time, so I can get into the details too much, but for higher levels of repression. So what these graphs show are the effects of living in a place where more people were arrested. And what you see is that if you have access to alternative TV, you are less likely to blame the opposition on the violence, and you're less likely to think that the government response was appropriate. Where you only had the government propaganda, the effects of seeing more repression go exactly in the opposite direction. You think that the opposition is to blame and the government did the right thing. Similar thing for whether you're going to vote for the communists and the opposition. And all of these things control for what people said they would vote for a month and a half earlier before this protest. And then finally, in terms of protest likelihood, we see the same sort of thing. If you are exposed to alternative TV, you become somewhat more likely to want to protest. If you are not, it's not quite significant. If you're not, you're much less likely. In other words, that sort of deterrent seems to work pretty well. We then tried to test the same sort of hypothesis in the broader set of countries. This is from the Gallup World Poll. And basically, what we find is that in countries that had higher political repression scores in that particular year, but had high alternative information, that reduced the confidence in the government. For countries where you had low alternative information, it increases the legitimacy. So in other words, the same patterns as what we see in Moldova. Quickly, in terms of the summary, we do see these uneven effects of repression. On the one hand, as a function of partisanship, as we see in Russia, and channeled through the effects of emotions. In the Moldovan case, we see the crucial role of independent media. And unfortunately, that is a story that and a lesson that a lot of the authoritarians have since incorporated quite well. The whole so-called Putin and others have very effectively marginalized any kind of independent media, and now we can sort of see why that works as well as it does. Of course, there are important scope conditions. In the Russian case, we saw that Russians responded to this repression by saying that they want to protest more. We have not seen massive protests necessarily since, and there's a question of whether a little bit of repression gets you more protest, but a lot of repression may actually not, and Yuri Zhukov has some interesting work in this respect. And then there's finally the question of short versus long-term effect. This echoes a little something that Liz said as well, right? In the context of these surveys, we see relatively short-term effects. The question is, how long does this anger last? And also, how long does the loss of legitimacy of the government versus these other types of signals last in the context of this ongoing game? Thank you.
So I'm going to invite our speakers to take to the table, even though we only have about 5 minutes or so for discussion, which is possible on this situation. I want to thank them for their incredible comments. And maybe we could take 2 or so.
This looks like we're being on trial here.
This is a show
trial. We confess, you know. This is a Stalinist trial. You know?
Greater good, initially growth, economic or political. And now, when freedom of association and freedom of movement is a public health hazard, to what extent do you think that government's perceived responses to the pandemic has actually served to legitimize more authoritarian modes of government going forward?
I think we'll take another question or two and then we'll come back to the panel. Is there another question that somebody would like to pose?
Thank you to the panelists. I have a question for Professor Shi, saying that correctly, about your presentation on China. I like the way you set up the puzzle about authoritarianism. Is it good or bad? And how China presents an interesting case study. I was curious whether in your work you're thinking about a comparative perspective at all with respect to the United States, where we're located. And I'm thinking about, of course, the rise of Christian nationalism in the US and other events, political events in the past few years. You can also see all kinds of repression, maybe not necessarily authoritarianism, but I was wondering whether there was any sort of comparative case study to be made there between China and the US, especially since there's a sense, as you said in the beginning, that we tend to see authoritarianism from a Western perspective as something that happens outside of the West, something that happens elsewhere.
Send it back. Who would like to start? Should we go in action?
Yeah, I'm going to just... Does this work? Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. I mean, one of the really very important issues that I was thinking about, it was actually the pandemic, and this is what I call the man-made natural disasters. You know, this is sort of a paradoxical sort of underlying there that for many people justified authoritarian intervention, and on the other side we see the reaction to that kind of authoritarianism, anti-vaxxers and stuff like that. So. And I think that's quite a significant kind of moment in the way we need to think about the planetary changes that are happening and that kind of planetary transformation is reshaping political orders without discrimination. And I think that's a very, very important moment for us to think about.
Is it on? Okay. The only thing I wanted to add, because that question wasn't really about my work, but the pandemic, in thinking about China and China's authoritarianism as an example to other parts of the world, there's a really interesting recent paper by Dan Mattingly where he finds that in the Middle East, the Chinese authoritarian model is one that's seen as being a positive one, right? It promotes development, but it also doesn't come with strings attached, right? So when the United States is promoting certain kinds of democracy, right, it also comes with, and we want you to do this with Israel, and we want you to do this with human rights. Oftentimes with China, it's just, here's the model, no strings attached, and it seems to work okay. So I just wanted to point that out. There is some empirical evidence suggesting as the Middle East learned more about China during the pandemic, and not always necessarily positive things, there was an increase in support for that model.
Or different kinds of strings attached.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
different kinds of
Chinese people, Chinese companies have to be employed. Usually it's economic supply conditions. And Chinese money, Chinese employee, Chinese technology. Those are not political constraints. 2 points. One is it is true in China for a long time, since the beginning of the pandemic, Chinese government said we have advantage, we have huge advantage over U.S. And for a long while, the claim was valid. COVID cases were very low in most of China until the beginning of this year. It was under control. And also we look at data. Chinese became very negative toward the U.S., mainly after they consumed media reports about how bad the situation was in China. Chinese developed sympathy for poor Americans who were suffering under COVID, and Chinese were proud they were not suffering the same way. Of course, that was changed later, towards the end of the pandemic, beginning around January 1st, end of December, and beginning of this year. Going back to comparison. I'm always interested in comparison, and sometimes I admire, not you, but some political scientists, economists, they can study 100 countries, 150 countries, no hesitation, because they're so smart. But I'm not. So I only know 2 countries, U.S. and China. It takes me a lot of courage to collaborate to work on anything else. Say, even I don't think I've worked on Japan. I've been in Japan many times. I worked on, anyway. So it's very hesitant for me. I've only worked on U.S. and China, and that's what I know. And in most of my work, comparative work, say education, equality, social mobility, family, social attitudes, I mainly have focused on U.S. China comparisons because they're most important countries for the world. And they're also huge contrasts. They're similar in terms of economy, also science, technology compared to countries. So I have compared implicitly or explicitly those 2 countries, but I haven't really studied other countries because I know so little. I'm not as good as many others who can study 150 countries at once. I don't know how they do it. I'm really hesitant to study any other country because I really don't know the historical context of other countries.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. The question of how COVID affects all of this is obviously an important one. And I think the Chinese example is interesting because the authoritarian model goes from looking bad very early on because of the secrecy and so on, to looking good for much of the pandemic and looking bad again. At some point, I gave an assignment to Princeton undergraduates in my intro to comparative class, and most of them sort of thought that authoritarianism seems to be better, right? Which was a little bit of a scary realization. It wasn't my intent in teaching the course, but I do think that the pandemic gave various types of political tools to authoritarians, and unfortunately, even a lot of democratic countries instituted measures that were problematic from a democratic standpoint. And Freedom House had a whole report about the countries in which political and civil freedoms had deteriorated, and it included a lot of nominal democracies, right? So not just the countries that were authoritarian to begin with and just sort of use this tool. And so I think that's quite possibly a legacy of COVID that we need to be careful about.
All right, so I'm going to just take a few seconds. I know people are eager to go. The first thing is I just really want to thank our panelists for a phenomenal set of conversations. We apologize for the lack of space for conversation, but thank you for being so generative, provocative, interesting, engaging. So first of all, let's thank them.
Thank you.
Secondly, I want to just add that I'm struck by, at a very meta level, how differently different disciplines oftentimes ask questions and pursue them. And so to be able to start from a very systemic perspective of how we think about the global context that shapes authoritarianism, to the move to think about people moving between spaces, then to look in situ within cases, that's really interesting, and it pushes us to move beyond a kind of methodological nationalism where we presume that authoritarianism can only be studied in one place, as opposed to recognizing that people move between those places, they learn from other places, and even if Yashar is encouraging us to think about cases in an important way, we're learning by thinking about these dynamics in other places. So the literature needs to move beyond a kind of methodological nationalism, that it's only one place as opposed to thinking about them in different ways, number one. Number two, I'm really struck by the normative preferences debate that's happened in this context, because when we do think about democracy, it's true that in the US context, we tend to think of it always as being normatively preferable. But this question of preferable for what? And when we think about delivery of goods relative to the right to have voice and participation, that dynamic has come through so strongly in this particular set of conversations. And then finally, I just want to note this question of how do we even know what people's preferences are and the circumstances under which they can speak out. Clearly, when you're in an authoritarian context, protest is one version, but it is the most extreme. And so this ability to think about the conditions under which people can speak, the conditions under which they can sustain that protest, the conditions under which they can shape their own governments, even if it comes at the expense of efficiency and the like. These normative debates really came through really strongly. So I hope we have more of these conversations. I want to thank our panelists, and let's give them another.